Imagine living in a world where falling in love was never simple. A glance across the room could mean everything, but saying too much could ruin your reputation. Every step of romance was filled with rules: who you could talk to, how you could sit, even how you held a fan or a handkerchief. In the Victorian era, dating wasn't just about emotions, it was about surviving a maze of expectations, family approval, and unspoken codes. Back then, you couldn't just ask someone out. You had to know the secret language of flowers, the hidden meanings in a folded letter, the daring message of a stolen dance. Love was silent, delicate, and often hidden beneath layers of duty and appearances. To us, it may sound exhausting, but to Victorians, it was thrilling, mysterious, and sometimes heartbreaking. So tonight, we're going to step back into that world. A world where romance was written in glances, where even the smallest touch could change a life, and where love was always balanced against duty. If you've ever wondered what dating was really like in the Victorian era, stay with me, because the truth is stranger, sweeter, and sometimes sadder than you might expect. In the Victorian era, dating as we think of it today did not really exist. There were no casual dinners, no quiet evenings at the cinema, no texting late at night just to say, "I miss you." Instead, romance lived under an elaborate system of rules, spoken and unspoken, that shaped every glance, every word, and every meeting between young men and women. To fall in love was not just a matter of two hearts. It was a performance, a ritual, a careful dance carried out under the eyes of family and society. The rules of romance were strict, and to break them risked not only scandal, but the possibility of ruining one's future. For a young Victorian woman, her reputation was her most valuable possession. Everything she did was measured by how it might reflect on her character. If she was seen as modest, disciplined, and proper, she could hope to attract a respectable suitor. If she was careless or bold, her reputation could be damaged, and society had a long memory. Even something as simple as smiling too warmly at a man in public could start gossip. A young man's reputation mattered too, but he had more freedom to make mistakes. Society expected him to pursue, while expecting her to guard her virtue like a treasure. The first rule of Victorian romance was that nothing happened without permission. Parents, especially mothers, controlled the opportunities their daughters had to meet young men. Social gatherings, balls, dinner parties, afternoon teas were the safe and proper spaces where courtship might begin. Even then, the interaction was carefully supervised. A girl was never to speak too freely, laugh too loudly, or show too much enthusiasm. A gentleman, on the other hand, was expected to be respectful but attentive, demonstrating good manners and steady character. Courtship was never a game of pure feeling. It was a negotiation of family expectations, wealth, class, and reputation. Eye contact carried meaning far greater than we might imagine today. To catch someone's gaze across a ballroom was not merely an accident. A glance held for too long could be interpreted as an invitation, a sign of interest, or even a subtle confession of affection. Women were trained to lower their eyes quickly, giving the impression of modesty. A gentleman, on the other hand, might linger a little longer, but even he had to be cautious. Too bold a look and he risked offending her. Too cautious, and she might believe he was indifferent. Romance began in these fleeting moments, where glances replaced words and silence carried more weight than speech. Conversation was equally bound by rules. A young woman could not simply approach a man and strike up a chat. That would have been considered unladylike. Introductions had to be made formally, usually through a family member or trusted friend. Once introduced, the topics were limited. Politics, religion, and money were too serious for the early stages of courtship. Instead, couples spoke of books, music, the weather, or the latest social events. A gentleman might compliment a lady's taste in fashion, though he had to do so carefully so as not to seem forward. A lady might comment on a dance or ask about his family, always keeping her words polite and measured. Even the pauses between sentences carried meaning, as if both were playing a delicate game of restraint. One important rule was that a lady must never appear too eager. To chase a man was considered improper. She was expected to wait, to be pursued, to allow him to demonstrate his devotion through persistence. A gentleman was permitted to show interest, but only within the bounds of good manners. He could not be too pushy or too obvious. The art of Victorian courtship lay in the balance. He must show enough attention to prove himself, while she must remain reserved enough to seem modest, yet not so cold as to discourage him entirely. This slow unfolding, full of pauses, hesitations, and half-spoken feelings, was at the heart of Victorian romance. Chaperones were another essential part of the system. A young couple was almost never alone together in the early stages of courtship. Mothers, aunts, or older siblings hovered nearby, ensuring that no inappropriate behavior could occur. Even a walk in the garden required supervision. Privacy was a rare and precious thing, and when couples did find themselves with a few moments apart, they treasured every word, every stolen glance. The presence of chaperones might feel suffocating, but it was considered a safeguard, preserving a young woman's reputation and ensuring that romance developed within acceptable boundaries. The unspoken rules extended beyond the couple themselves to the wider community. Friends and neighbors watched closely, ready to whisper about who danced with whom, who lingered too long at a tea table, who exchanged too many letters. Gossip was a powerful force, and it could ruin a courtship before it even began. That is why discretion was prized. A gentleman might express admiration in subtle ways, asking for the honor of multiple dances, calling at the family home under the guise of friendship, or sending a book with a careful inscription. Each gesture was noticed, but it was always wrapped in the cloak of propriety. There was also an economic and social dimension to these rules. Love alone was rarely enough. Families considered wealth, status, and background before approving a match. A gentleman might admire a young woman sincerely, but if her dowry was too small, his family might disapprove. Likewise, a young woman might dream of romance, but she was expected to think about stability, comfort, and the future security of her household. In this way, the rules of romance were not only about protecting virtue, but also about protecting the interests of families and preserving social order. Yet within these strict boundaries, genuine affection did blossom. Couples learned to read between the lines, to hear meaning in the smallest of words, to treasure the faintest signs of attention. The restraint of the era gave weight to the simplest gestures. A hand offered to help a lady step into a carriage, a rose left at her seat during a dance, or a compliment carefully delivered under her father's watchful gaze. These moments carried the intensity of romance precisely because they were so rare and so carefully controlled. We can imagine the tension of such encounters. A young woman sits in her family's parlor, her hands folded in her lap. A suitor has been invited for tea. Her mother sits nearby, knitting but listening closely. The conversation is polite, almost painfully so. The weather, a book recently published, perhaps a concert in town. But beneath the surface, both feel the current of attraction. Their eyes meet for the briefest second, and that small glance feels like a secret shared. In that world, romance was not wild or spontaneous. It was disciplined, deliberate, and filled with layers of meaning. The rules of romance shaped not only how people loved, but also how they remembered love. Courtships were slow, measured, and often frustratingly restrained, but they were also rich in anticipation and longing. Every letter written, every dance shared, every carefully chosen word mattered. The system may seem rigid to us today, but for the Victorians, it gave structure to one of life's most unpredictable emotions. And within that structure, they found ways to express devotion, passion, and the hope of building a future together. In the end, the strict rules of Victorian romance remind us of how different love once looked, and how much it was shaped by the world around it. For them, love was never only personal. It was public, social, and bound to reputation. Yet, within those rules, hearts still beat faster, hands still trembled, and dreams of love still grew. The rules may have been strict, but the feelings were as timeless as they are today. In the Victorian world, where direct declarations of love were discouraged and privacy was almost impossible, couples turned to small objects and subtle gestures to communicate what words could not. Among these, gloves became one of the most surprising and powerful tools in the language of romance. At first glance, a glove might seem like nothing more than a practical accessory, something to protect the hands from cold weather or dirt in the streets. But in an age when every gesture was watched and judged, gloves became a part of a secret code, a way for young men and women to send messages that only the two of them could understand. For Victorians, gloves carried layers of meaning. They were considered essential to a proper outfit, especially for women. To appear in public without gloves was often seen as careless, even immodest. Hands were thought to be one of the most intimate parts of the body, soft, delicate, and not always meant for public display. Covering them with gloves preserved a lady's modesty, while removing them in the right context suggested trust, comfort, or even intimacy. That alone gave gloves a powerful place in the silent dialogue of courtship. A young woman might wear white gloves to a dance, smooth and spotless, symbolizing purity and elegance. If she dropped one, intentionally or not, it could signal an opening for a gentleman to approach. To retrieve a lady's glove and hand it back was a moment of physical closeness, a chance for eyes to meet, for fingers to brush against each other for the smallest thrill of contact in a world where such things were rare. If she accepted the glove back with a smile or a lowered gaze, it might suggest encouragement. If she ignored him, or if her chaperone quickly intervened, the moment closed as quickly as it opened. There were even written guides that outlined a kind of language of the glove, much like the famous language of the fan, or language of flowers. According to these codes, how a woman held her gloves could send a message. Twisting them in her hands might show nervousness or excitement. Dropping them deliberately could invite attention. Slipping them on slowly might suggest that she was ready to leave a gathering, while removing one glove during conversation could be read as a sign of growing comfort or familiarity. Whether everyone truly followed these codes or not, the idea that gloves carried hidden messages made them fascinating tools for romance. For men, gloves also carried weight. A gentleman's gloves had to be well kept and spotless, a sign of his discipline and respectability. To present himself with stained or torn gloves was unthinkable, as it suggested carelessness. Offering a hand in a clean glove showed respect, but offering a bare hand, especially in private, could be a bolder signal. To shake a lady's ungloved hand was considered an intimate gesture, something that might only happen once mutual affection was established. The removal of gloves on both sides became symbolic of lowering barriers and allowing greater closeness. We can imagine a scene at a Victorian ball. A young woman sits with her mother and aunt, her white-gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. A gentleman approaches, bowing respectfully, and asks for the honor of a dance. As she rises, one glove slips from her fingers and falls to the polished floor. He stoops quickly to retrieve it, his hand brushing against the delicate fabric. For a moment, their eyes meet. The glove becomes more than an accessory. It is a bridge between them, a shared secret in a world of watchful eyes. She accepts it back with a soft, "Thank you," and though the words are simple, both understand the moment is charged with meaning. The importance of gloves in courtship also reflected the Victorian obsession with appearances. Clothing was never just about fabric, it was about character, respectability, and morality. A woman who wore her gloves properly was seen as disciplined and modest. A man whose gloves were neat and clean was judged to be reliable and respectable. In this way, gloves acted as a kind of silent testimony. They were proof that a person belonged to polite society, that they respected the codes of behavior that defined the era. But as with so many rules, young people found ways to bend them. Lovers sometimes exchanged gloves as tokens of affection, much like flowers or lockets. A woman might give her suitor one of her gloves as a keepsake, allowing him to carry a piece of her with him when they were apart. Such a gift was both innocent and daring. Innocent because it was just an object. Daring because it carried the scent of her perfume, the impression of her hand, the suggestion of closeness. For the suitor, receiving a glove was a sign of encouragement, a message to continue his pursuit. Even in rejection, gloves played a role. To refuse a dance, a woman might adjust her gloves and turn her gaze away, signaling politely but firmly that she was not interested. To hand a glove back without warmth could suggest that her feelings were not returned. These were subtle gestures, but in the careful world of Victorian romance they spoke loudly. Couples learned to read these signs as fluently as if they were spoken words, turning gloves into part of a delicate, ongoing conversation. The symbolism of gloves went even further in engagements and weddings. To exchange rings meant removing gloves, revealing the hand fully. In that act, a woman symbolically opened herself to a new stage of life, one where intimacy and trust were allowed to grow. The bare hand, so rarely seen in public, became a sign of belonging, of being claimed and cherished. The glove, once a barrier, was set aside in favor of closeness. In all these ways, gloves show us how carefully love had to be managed in the Victorian era. Today, we think nothing of holding hands, hugging, or speaking openly about attraction. But for Victorians, even the smallest gesture carried layers of meaning. A glove dropped, a glove returned, a glove slipped off in the right moment. These actions shaped the course of romance. The rules may seem rigid now, but within those rules, young men and women found ways to speak with their hands when their voices were not free to do so. When we look back, the language of the glove feels both strange and beautiful. Strange because it seems so distant from our casual expressions of affection. Beautiful because it reminds us that love can flourish even under the strictest rules, finding its way through the smallest openings. For the Victorians, every detail mattered. A single glove could carry the weight of 100 words, and in that silence, romance became all the more powerful. In the Victorian era, romance was never simply between two people. It was always under the watchful eyes of others, and nowhere was this clearer than in the presence of chaperones. If today we think of dating as private, personal, and even secretive at times, the Victorians thought the opposite. For them, a young couple left alone together was a dangerous situation, full of risk to reputation, family honor, and social order. That is why almost every meeting, every stroll, and every conversation had a third party present. Chaperones were the silent guardians of Victorian romance, making sure that everything stayed within the boundaries of propriety. The rule was simple. A young unmarried woman of good family was never to be alone with a man who was not her relative. Even a brief moment in a room without a witness could lead to gossip. If someone saw them, people might assume impropriety, even if nothing had happened, and gossip, once it spread, could destroy a woman's chance at a respectable marriage. That is why chaperones were considered necessary, not just as protectors of virtue, but also as protectors of appearances. Most often, the role of chaperone fell to the mother. Mothers accompanied their daughters to balls, tea parties, and visits, always keeping a careful eye on their behavior. They listened to conversations, monitored the number of dances with one partner, and intervened if a gentleman seemed too forward. If the mother was unavailable, the duty might fall to an aunt, an older sister, or even a trusted family friend. The important thing was that someone responsible, someone whose presence carried weight, was always there to bear witness. At social events like balls, the chaperone's role was both strict and strategic. She introduced her daughter to suitable young men, encouraged polite conversation, and allowed dances when appropriate. But she also set limits. A lady might dance with the same gentleman once or twice, but never so often that it suggested favoritism. A chaperone kept count, making sure her daughter appeared friendly but not too familiar. She might also decline a dance on her daughter's behalf if the gentleman was considered unsuitable, offering a polite excuse like fatigue or an already full dance card. The daughter herself had little power to refuse directly without causing offense, so the chaperone acted as both shield and guide. Even outdoor activities required supervision. If a couple wished to walk in a garden, they were usually accompanied by a chaperone trailing discreetly behind, or perhaps by a younger sibling who could not be sent away. Carriage rides, one of the most romantic gestures of the era, were rarely granted without an older relative seated nearby. Even letters between lovers were sometimes read, or at least monitored by parents, who wanted to ensure that nothing inappropriate was being exchanged. Privacy was rare, and because it was rare, moments of true privacy became all the more charged with emotion. Chaperones also played a role in shaping how romance developed. Their presence meant that couples learned to communicate subtly, through looks, gestures, and carefully chosen words. A gentleman might compliment a lady's gown in the presence of her mother, his tone respectful, his gaze only briefly lingering. She might lower her eyes and smile faintly, a signal that her feelings matched his, though she could not say so aloud. The chaperone might notice, or she might pretend not to. These small hidden exchanges carried the excitement of secrecy, even when they unfolded in full view of family and friends. The rules around chaperones were not only about morality, they were also about control. Families, especially fathers, wanted to ensure that marriages were made with suitable partners. A wealthy heiress left to her own devices might fall for a charming but penniless man. A young gentleman, unsupervised, might take advantage of a girl's trust and then abandon her, leaving her reputation in ruins. By requiring chaperones, families maintained power over courtship, keeping it a family affair rather than a private one. We can imagine a scene in a Victorian drawing room. A young man has come to call, his card presented at the door. He is invited in and seated with the family. The daughter enters, her cheeks faintly flushed, but she does not sit beside him. Instead, she takes a chair near her mother, who continues her embroidery while listening closely. The young man speaks politely about the weather, about books, about mutual acquaintances. Every word is measured, every gesture cautious, because he knows he is not only courting the daughter, he is also courting her mother's approval. If he is witty, respectful, and steady, he earns another visit. If he falters, the opportunity may never return. In the countryside, the rules could sometimes relax but never disappear entirely. A picnic or outdoor gathering might allow couples to walk together for a few minutes out of earshot, but still within sight. A gentleman might offer his arm to help a lady over uneven ground, his hand steadying her lightly. Such touches, though innocent, carried enormous meaning. The chaperones nearby might pretend to be distracted, allowing these small freedoms, but only so far. Everyone understood the boundaries, and everyone understood what was at stake if they were crossed. The presence of chaperones could feel suffocating, but it also added to the drama of romance. Lovers had to be creative, finding ways to share their feelings within the narrow limits allowed. A glance exchanged across a room, a whispered word on the way back from a dance, a note slipped into a bouquet of flowers. These gestures became treasures because they were rare. In a sense, the chaperone's watchful presence made love feel even more intense, because it was always lived in the space between desire and restraint. Yet not everyone followed the rules perfectly. Some couples did manage to slip away, to steal private moments in gardens, hallways, or secluded corners of a ballroom. Scandals did happen, and when they did, they spread quickly through gossip. But most couples understood that to risk being caught was to risk everything. The loss of a woman's reputation could mean the loss of her future. The failure of a man to show respect could mean the loss of his chance with her entirely. So, while stories of broken rules are tantalizing, most courtships stayed within the expected path, carefully guided by the ever-present chaperone. Looking back, the system of chaperones tells us much about Victorian values. Love was not seen as a private matter between two individuals, but as a public, social event shaped by family and society. Romance unfolded not in secret, but under supervision, with rules that protected virtue, reputation, and the interests of both families. And yet, within those rules, people still found ways to love, to dream, and to connect. The chaperone may have been ever present, but so was the quiet heartbeat of romance, finding expression in glances, words, and moments too small for even the sharpest eyes to fully control. In the Victorian era, love letters were one of the most important tools of romance. In a world where couples were rarely left alone and conversations were often overheard, the written word became a private escape, a way for two people to express thoughts and emotions they could never say aloud in public. To write a letter was not just to send words, it was to reveal one's heart carefully, with ink and paper as the only witnesses. And, like everything else in Victorian courtship, even love letters had their own rules, rituals, and unspoken expectations. A letter could never be casual. Every sentence, every word, every flourish of the pen carried meaning. Language was formal, but within that formality there was room for creativity, emotion, and even passion. A gentleman might begin with a polite address. "My dear Miss," but beneath the politeness was often a longing that grew stronger with every line. He had to be careful not to appear too forward, but he also needed to show genuine feeling. For a lady, responding to such a letter required equal caution. Too much warmth could damage her reputation. Too little could discourage a suitor she secretly admired. Writing was a balancing act between honesty and restraint. The style of the letters reflected the era's love of poetry, novels, and elaborate expressions. Many Victorians quoted lines from Shakespeare or Byron, using literature as a shield for their emotions. Instead of writing, "I love you," a gentleman might write, "Your presence is as light to my soul as the dawn after a long night." A lady might respond not with a direct declaration, but with a carefully chosen phrase that hinted at her affection. "Your words bring a smile I dare not show." The beauty of these letters was that they allowed two people to speak freely, while still keeping within the bounds of respectability. The way a letter was delivered also mattered. In many cases, letters passed through the hands of servants, postmen, or even family members. Discretion was essential. A lady might receive a note slipped into a bouquet of flowers, hidden inside a book, or delivered by a trusted maid. Sealed envelopes became symbols of intimacy. To break a seal and open a letter was to enter a private world, one meant for the eyes of the beloved alone. Red wax seals were common, and sometimes suitors pressed their family crest into the wax, a sign of seriousness and honor. In more daring cases, a simple flourish, a personal mark, or even the trace of perfume on the paper carried a more intimate message. For couples separated by distance, letters became lifelines. A young man traveling for work or serving in the military might write regularly to reassure his sweetheart of his devotion. A young woman staying with relatives might write from the countryside, describing her days while slipping in quiet hints of longing. These letters were read and reread, often kept carefully tied with ribbon and hidden in drawers or boxes. For some, a single letter could be enough to sustain hope for months, its words memorized and repeated in secret. Yet, letters also carried risks. If discovered by disapproving parents or siblings, they could spark scandal. A family might read too much into a lady's responses, accusing her of being too forward, or criticize a gentleman for being too bold. Letters could even be used as evidence in disputes, proving or disproving claims of affection, betrayal, or broken promises. That is why many Victorians wrote in careful, coded ways, saying much without ever saying too much. The art of suggestion was everything. We can imagine a scene in a quiet Victorian parlor. A young woman sits at her desk, the curtains drawn, her mother in the next room. Before her lies a folded letter, sealed in wax, delivered that morning. Her heart beats quickly as she opens it, careful not to tear the paper. Inside, in elegant script, her suitor has written of last night's ball, how he cherished the dance they shared, how he hopes to see her again soon. He does not write "I love you," but she reads it in the spaces between his words. She takes up her pen to reply, her hand trembling slightly. She writes of the music, of her gratitude for his kindness, but her final line lingers. "Your absence is keenly felt today." She sprinkles a little lavender water on the paper before sealing it, hoping he will notice the faint scent when he opens it. Love letters were also treasured keepsakes, sometimes lasting long after romance ended. A woman might keep them hidden even after marrying another, the faded ink a reminder of a youthful courtship. A man might carry a folded note in his pocket for years, the paper worn but still legible, a silent companion through his days. Letters had weight because they were physical, tangible objects. Unlike words spoken and forgotten, a letter could be held, pressed to the lips, or locked away as proof of love once given. In some cases, letters even shaped the course of engagements. A suitor who wrote too often or too passionately risked being seen as rash. A lady who delayed her responses too long risked appearing indifferent. Timing was as important as content. Families, too, sometimes judged a suitor's worth by the quality of his letters. Neat handwriting, good grammar, and elegant phrasing all suggested education, refinement, and seriousness. A clumsy letter could hurt a man as chances more than a poorly chosen word at a ball. The art of sealing and delivering letters became part of the romance itself. Colored wax, embossed stamps, or decorative envelopes could carry their own messages. To slip a letter into the hand of a trusted servant, to receive one tucked inside a bouquet, or to find one left discreetly at the edge of a desk, each act added to the thrill of secrecy and intimacy. Every detail mattered, from the way the paper was folded to the way the signature was written. Looking back, the world of Victorian love letters feels far removed from our instant messages and video calls. Yet the longing, the caution, and the joy they carried are timeless. To wait days or weeks for a reply, to read and reread the same words by candlelight, to treasure every line as if it were a piece of the beloved S soul. This was the reality of Victorian courtship. Their letters remind us that love can thrive even under the tightest restrictions, finding ways to speak through ink, paper, and carefully chosen words. For the Victorians, love letters were not only messages. They were promises, risks, and memories preserved. They carried the weight of hope, the thrill of secrecy, and the quiet power of two people daring to reach for each other in a world that kept them apart. In the Victorian world, love was rarely spoken of openly, so couples found other ways to express affection. One of the most meaningful methods was through courtship gifts. These tokens were not chosen at random. Each gift carried layers of symbolism, etiquette, and unspoken promises. Giving a gift was not simply about generosity. It was about sending a message, a declaration of interest, and sometimes even a test of whether those feelings were returned. In a society where every gesture was judged, the right gift could deepen a romance, while the wrong one could risk offense or even scandal. Flowers were perhaps the most common and powerful gifts. The Victorians believed in the language of flowers, where each bloom carried a meaning. A red rose meant deep love, while white roses symbolized purity. Violets spoke of loyalty, lilies of devotion, and forget-me-nots of remembrance. A young man might send a carefully arranged bouquet to a lady, each flower chosen to tell a story without a single word written on paper. A lady, in turn, could accept the bouquet graciously as a sign of encouragement, or she might decline it, allowing the gesture to fade unacknowledged. Even how the flowers were arranged or tied with ribbon could carry significance. To receive flowers was to receive not just beauty, but a secret message hidden in petals. Jewelry was another common gift, but here the rules were strict. A man did not simply shower a woman with jewels at the beginning of courtship. To do so would have been considered improper, even presumptuous. Instead, jewelry came later, often as part of an engagement or as a symbol of serious intent. A simple locket, however, could be exchanged earlier, especially if it contained a lock of hair. Hair was considered deeply personal and intimate, and to give a strand of one's hair sealed in a locket was to give a piece of oneself. Many young women treasured such gifts, wearing them on chains close to their hearts. Books and poetry also became tokens of romance. A gentleman might send a volume of poetry to a lady, his feelings hidden in the choice of lines or in a careful inscription written inside the cover. A favorite sonnet, a dedication in neat handwriting, or even a pressed flower hidden between the pages could all transform a simple book into a declaration of love. For women who were educated and loved literature, such gifts were both thoughtful and romantic. They also allowed couples to share a private world of imagination and emotion, even if their real lives were bound by strict rules. Small personal items often carried the greatest meaning. A gentleman might present a lady with a handkerchief, embroidered with her initials, or he might treasure one given to him by her. Fans, gloves, or ribbons could all become keepsakes. To exchange such an item was to create a bond, a reminder that the other person was always near in spirit, even when far away in distance. These gifts could be carried in pockets, worn discreetly, or tucked into drawers, serving as secret links between two hearts. Of course, not all gifts were accepted, and not all were welcome. A woman who wished to discourage a suitor might politely decline his tokens, or she might return them, signaling that his advances were not desired. To accept a gift carried weight. It was not done lightly. Society assumed that if a lady accepted certain types of presents, she was showing genuine interest. This was especially true with jewelry or anything of high value. To take such a gift and then reject the man later could lead to whispers of manipulation or impropriety. In this way, gifts became as much a part of social negotiation as they were of romance. There were even unspoken rules about timing. A gift given too early in courtship could be seen as pushy, while one given too late might appear indifferent. A bouquet after a dance, a locket after a few months of visits, a book during a time apart. Each had its place in the rhythm of romance. Families watched closely, too. Parents might view an expensive gift as a sign of serious intent, or they might frown upon it if they believed the suitor unworthy. Courtship was always a family affair, and gifts were often seen not just as personal tokens, but as gestures toward the family as a whole. We can picture a quiet exchange in a Victorian drawing room. A young man calls upon a lady and her family, presenting her with a small package wrapped in paper and tied with string. Inside is a slim volume of poetry, the pages edged in gilt. On the inside cover, in careful handwriting, he has written a short dedication. To Miss E., whose kindness brings light to every room she enters. Her cheeks warm as she reads it, and though her mother watches nearby, both she and the gentleman know that this is no casual gift. Later, in the privacy of her room, the young woman will read the poems by candlelight, wondering which lines he meant for her. Another scene unfolds in a garden after a Sunday service. A gentleman presents a small bouquet of violets and white roses, the flowers tied with a blue ribbon. The lady accepts them with a soft smile, and though no words are spoken, her acceptance is an answer in itself. She places the bouquet in water on her dressing table where the blooms will remind her of him until they fade. For him, the simple act of giving the flowers has opened the door to deeper courtship. For her, the acceptance of them is a quiet declaration of interest. Even the smallest objects carried power in the Victorian world of romance. A pressed flower hidden in a book, a ribbon worn at the wrist, a glove returned with a faint smile. All these could mean far more than the boldest words. In a society where love had to be veiled, gifts were the language of the heart. They gave shape to feelings that could not be spoken, and they created memories that lingered long after the object itself was gone. Looking back, the tradition of courtship gifts reminds us that romance is as much about symbols as it is about words. For Victorians, every gift was part of a larger story, a careful performance of love within the rules of society. They may not have been able to speak freely, but they could give, receive, and treasure tokens that spoke more eloquently than any declaration. And in those small tokens, love quietly grew. In the Victorian world, the dance floor was one of the rare spaces where romance could bloom more freely, though even there, the rules of society guided every step. A ball was not simply an evening of music and movement. It was a stage, a ritual, a chance for young men and women to meet, observe, and carefully begin the process of courtship under the glow of candlelight and the watchful gaze of family and friends. For many, the ballroom was where first glances turned into conversations, where hands touched for the briefest moment, and where love stories began. Balls were important social events, carefully planned and eagerly anticipated. Invitations were sent weeks in advance, dresses were chosen with care, and every detail mattered. For young women, especially those just entering society, the ball was one of the few places where they could meet potential suitors. For young men, it was their opportunity to prove their manners, charm, and suitability. Every introduction, every dance, every word spoken could carry weight for the future. The stakes were high, and everyone knew it. The rules of the dance floor were strict. A young woman could not simply choose whom she wished to dance with, she had to be asked. To accept a gentleman's invitation was a polite duty, but to accept the same man more than once in a single evening could spark gossip. It might suggest favoritism, or worse, a secret understanding between them. To avoid scandal, a lady usually danced with a variety of partners, giving no one too much attention. Yet within these rules, there was still room for signals, for hidden messages carried by the choice of dance or the way a smile lingered. Each type of dance also carried its own meaning. The waltz, for instance, was considered daring when it first appeared, because it allowed a gentleman to hold a lady close and move with her across the floor. For many young women, their first waltz was a thrilling but nerve-wracking experience. The quadrille or the polka, on the other hand, were livelier and more social, giving couples chances to exchange quick words and glances before spinning away into the arms of another partner. To share a slow, elegant dance was a privilege, often reserved for someone special, while to miss a dance one had promised to another could be taken as an insult. Chaperones, of course, were always present, lining the edges of the ballroom, fanning themselves and pretending to chat while keeping sharp eyes on every movement. A mother might watch carefully as her daughter danced with a particular young man, noting his manners, his posture, and his conversation. Was he attentive without being too forward? Was her daughter reserved but polite? These observations would be remembered later when families discussed whether a suitor was worthy of further attention. The dance was never just about two people. It was about the approval of everyone watching. Yet, despite the formality, the dance floor offered more freedom than most settings. For a few minutes, a young man and woman could speak privately, their words hidden by the music and the motion of the crowd. They might exchange polite remarks about the orchestra or the decorations, but beneath those words ran deeper meanings. A question about whether she liked the music might really be an invitation to reveal her tastes. A compliment on her gown might be a coded way of expressing admiration for her beauty. The rhythm of the dance gave them a chance to connect, however briefly, in ways they could not in a crowded drawing room. We can imagine the atmosphere of such a night. The chandeliers blaze with candlelight, reflecting off mirrors and polished floors. The orchestra begins a waltz, and couples take to the floor. A young woman, dressed in pale silk, places her gloved hand lightly in the hand of her partner. They move together, her skirts brushing against his boots, their eyes meeting now and then as they circle the room. For a moment, the world shrinks to the two of them, even though they are surrounded by dozens of others. She feels the warmth of his hand through the glove, the steadiness of his arm guiding her, and though neither speaks of love, both sense the possibility of something more. After the dance, the gentleman leads her back to her seat, bows, and thanks her. She offers a polite smile, but perhaps her gaze lingers for a second longer than necessary. It is a small moment, but in the world of Victorian courtship, small moments were everything. That one dance might lead to another conversation, another meeting, another step toward a future together. For many couples, balls were where relationships truly began. The repeated act of dancing together, speaking politely, and demonstrating mutual respect laid the foundation for courtship. Families paid attention too, noting which men asked which women to dance, how often, and how they conducted themselves. A gentleman who ignored his duties on the dance floor, refusing to dance with less fashionable partners or behaving rudely, would soon gain a reputation for arrogance. A young lady who danced too freely, laughing too loudly, or spending too much time with one man risked being labeled indiscreet. The balance between enjoyment and propriety was delicate, and everyone walked the line carefully. Beyond the glitter of the ballroom, dances also symbolized the ideal of harmony in romance. To move gracefully with a partner, to keep in rhythm, to guide and be guided, these mirrored the values Victorians prized in marriage itself. A good partner on the dance floor was assumed to be steady, respectful, and reliable, the same qualities desired in a husband or wife. That is why so much weight was placed on the simple act of dancing. It was more than music and movement. It was practice for the roles society expected couples to play for the rest of their lives. Looking back, the dance floor was one of the few arenas where love and duty intertwined in a way that allowed both freedom and restraint. Couples could experience the thrill of closeness, the spark of attraction, all while staying within the accepted rules of society. The ball was a stage, but it was also a place of possibility, where the next dance could change the course of a life. For the Victorians, romance often began not with words, but with the sweep of music, the turn of a waltz, and the silent promise held in the touch of a hand. In the carefully ordered world of Victorian romance, even the simplest activities could carry enormous meaning. A stroll in the garden, a walk through a park, or a ride in a carriage might seem harmless to us today, but in the 19th century, these moments were considered daring, sometimes even scandalous, because they allowed a man and woman to spend time together with fewer eyes watching. In a society where privacy was rare and courtship was bound by endless rules, such outings were not just pleasant diversions, they were bold steps toward intimacy. The rules of a walk were as strict as those of the ballroom. A young lady could not simply decide to take a stroll with a gentleman. Permission had to be given, and usually a chaperone accompanied them. But sometimes, whether by intention or by chance, couples managed a few minutes where they could walk side by side, speaking quietly, away from the constant supervision of family. A garden path, winding and shaded by trees, offered opportunities for conversation that felt almost private. Even if a mother or aunt trailed behind, the sense of closeness was stronger than in a crowded parlor or ballroom. Carriage rides were even more daring. To sit side by side in such a small space, away from the eyes of the crowd, was to allow a level of closeness unusual in Victorian society. The sound of horses' hooves, the jostling of the wheels, the occasional brush of a shoulder, these details made the experience quietly thrilling. But because of the intimacy implied, not every young woman was permitted to ride in a carriage with a man. To do so without a chaperone might raise eyebrows, suggesting a degree of attachment that was not yet confirmed. Only when a courtship had advanced, and the gentleman had earned the family's trust, was such an outing considered acceptable. The symbolism of walking together was deeply understood in the Victorian mind. To stroll beside someone at the same pace was a visible sign of harmony and companionship. It suggested that the two were in step not only on the path, but in life itself. Observers noticed these things. A gentleman who walked too far ahead seemed arrogant. One who lagged behind seemed inattentive. But one who matched a lady's pace, steady and respectful, was thought to show good character. Even the act of offering an arm as they walked across uneven ground carried meaning. To accept was to trust him. To refuse politely might signal hesitation. We can imagine a Sunday afternoon in a quiet village. After church, families mingle in the churchyard, exchanging pleasantries. A young gentleman asks if he might escort a lady and her mother on a short walk through the garden nearby. The mother agrees, though she stays a few steps behind. The young man offers his arm, and the lady accepts with a faint smile. They walk slowly, speaking of the sermon, the flowers, the changing season. To an outsider, the conversation seems ordinary. But for the two of them, every word carries weight. His question about her favorite flowers is really a way of learning her tastes. Her remark about enjoying quiet walks is really an invitation for him to ask again in the future. Carriage rides carried even more risk and more excitement. A young woman seated in a carriage with a man was suddenly outside the structure of the parlor, the ballroom, or the garden. The road stretched before them. The countryside unfolded around them, and for a time, it felt like the world was their own. Some couples treasured these moments as the truest steps toward intimacy, speaking more freely than they ever could indoors. But because society was quick to judge, families monitored such outings carefully. A carriage ride might only be allowed if the gentleman was seen as a serious suitor, someone who could be trusted to respect both the lady and her reputation. In literature and diaries of the era, these walks and rides often appear as turning points in courtships. A conversation shared during a quiet stroll might be remembered for a lifetime. A glance exchanged in the shadow of trees, or the comfort of sitting side by side in a moving carriage, often signaled that affection had grown deeper. For young people constrained by endless rules, these brief moments of semi-privacy were treasured more than the grandest gestures. But the presence of risk was always there. To be seen walking too closely together, or riding alone without approval, could give rise to rumors. Neighbors might whisper, families might disapprove, reputations might be at stake. This was the paradox of Victorian romance. The very moments that allowed intimacy were also the ones most likely to invite scrutiny. Couples had to balance their desire for closeness with the constant awareness that every step was watched and judged. Yet within these boundaries, love often found a way to grow. A lady might tuck a flower from the garden into her parasol, a silent acknowledgement of the walk she had just shared. A gentleman might remember the sound of her laughter during a carriage ride, replaying it in his mind long after the moment had passed. These were small things, but in an era of restraint, small things carried enormous power. Looking back, the idea of a simple walk or ride as daring may seem strange. Today, couples can go to restaurants, movies, or long drives without a second thought. But in Victorian times, the smallest freedoms were charged with meaning. To stroll side by side was to take a step toward trust. To ride in a carriage together was to declare a closeness noticed by all. And for those who lived within the strict codes of the era, these gestures were not small at all. They were milestones, remembered long after, as the quiet beginnings of lifelong attachments. In the end, strolls and carriage rides remind us how love finds its way even in the most rigid societies. The rules may have been strict, the eyes of family always near, but a garden path or a carriage seat offered a space where two people could share a little more of themselves. And in those moments, beneath the careful restraint of the Victorian world, real affection had room to grow. In a world where direct speech about love was discouraged, Victorians became masters of silent communication. Courtship was filled with restrictions, conversations were monitored, meetings were supervised, and every action was bound by rules of propriety. Yet people still longed to connect, to send messages that went beyond polite small talk. To achieve this, they developed an entire system of secret codes and signals, using everyday objects like handkerchiefs, fans, and parasols as tools of hidden romance. What seems like a small gesture today, a flick of the wrist, the tilt of a fan, the way a handkerchief was held, could once carry entire conversations without a single word spoken. Handkerchiefs were perhaps the simplest and most versatile. Almost every lady carried one, delicately embroidered with her initials or trimmed with lace. Dropping a handkerchief was not always an accident. Sometimes it was a deliberate signal. If a gentleman rushed to retrieve it, the way she received it back told him whether his attention was welcome. If she accepted it with a shy smile, it could mean encouragement. If she barely acknowledged him, it might mean indifference. A handkerchief held in the right hand, waved lightly, might mean, "I am interested," while holding it tightly or folding it away could signal disapproval. Even the way it was tucked into a glove or draped across the lap carried meaning for those who knew the code. Fans were another powerful tool, especially at dances and social gatherings. A fan was not only a way to keep cool in crowded ballrooms, it was a language all its own. A lady could conceal her face with her fan, glance coyly over the top, or snap it shut with a decisive flick. Each action had significance. To slowly fan oneself might suggest interest. To close the fan sharply could signal rejection. Holding the fan open wide could be playful, while drawing it across the cheek might suggest flirtation. Gentlemen watched closely, trying to interpret the silent messages. Some manuals of the time even published lists of fan gestures, though it is uncertain how many were truly used. Still, the idea that a fan could speak volumes added mystery and charm to Victorian courtship. Parasols, too, played their part. On sunny afternoons, ladies carried parasols to shield their skin from the sun, since pale complexions were considered fashionable. But parasols could also be angled in ways that sent signals. To tilt it forward might show disinterest, while tilting it back could suggest openness. Resting it lightly on the shoulder might be an invitation for conversation. Because parasols were so visible in public spaces, they became convenient tools for sending discreet messages that outsiders might overlook. A simple turn of the wrist could transform a casual walk into a silent dialogue. These codes were not always formal or universally understood. Much of the communication depended on shared understanding between the couple. If two people had developed a connection, they learned to interpret each other's gestures more personally. A gentleman might know that a lady's habit of twirling her parasol meant she was nervous, or that her way of folding her handkerchief meant she was secretly pleased. These private interpretations made the gestures even more meaningful, turning ordinary objects into personal languages of love. We can imagine a scene at a summer garden party. A young woman sits beneath a tree, her parasol resting lightly on her shoulder. Across the lawn, her suitor watches, waiting for a sign. She tilts the parasol back ever so slightly, catching his eye for a brief second before looking away. To anyone else, it seems like nothing at all, a simple adjustment against the sun. But to him, it is permission to approach. He crosses the grass, bows politely, and begins a conversation about the roses nearby. No one notices the silent exchange that brought him there. Or picture a ballroom glittering with candlelight. A lady sits with her mother, fanning herself slowly after a lively dance. A gentleman she admires approaches, asking for the next waltz. She raises her fan just enough to conceal her smile before lowering it and giving a graceful nod. The gesture says everything: her interest, her pleasure, her willingness to share another dance. The fan speaks what her lips cannot. These secret codes were thrilling because they created intimacy in a world that allowed so little of it. Couples could communicate in ways that parents, chaperones, or onlookers might not detect. Every flick of a fan or flutter of a handkerchief felt like a shared secret, a moment carved out of the rigid structure of society. The very act of sending and receiving such signals deepened the sense of connection, because it meant both people were in on the secret, both aware of the delicate game being played. Of course, not every signal was perfectly understood. A misplaced gesture could cause confusion. A lady might truly drop her handkerchief by accident, leading a gentleman to believe she was interested when she was not. A fan might be snapped shut simply out of annoyance at the heat, not at the suitor standing nearby. Misinterpretations happened, and sometimes they became fodder for gossip or awkwardness. Yet even this uncertainty added to the drama of courtship. Every gesture was risky, every signal a gamble, and that made the successes all the sweeter. The fascination with secret codes also reflected the Victorian love of symbolism. This was an age when everything carried hidden meaning: flowers, jewelry, colors, even the arrangement of furniture in a parlor. Romance was not only about feelings, but about the art of expressing those feelings indirectly. To say something outright was often considered too bold, even improper. But to hide meaning in objects and gestures made love seem mysterious, poetic, and noble. Looking back, these secret codes and signals remind us of how resourceful people can be when faced with restrictions. Denied the freedom to speak openly, Victorians invented new languages out of the things they carried every day. A fan, a parasol, a handkerchief. Simple objects became powerful tools of communication, weaving silent conversations in rooms filled with noise and rules. Today, these gestures may seem quaint, even unnecessary in a world of instant messages and open expressions of love. Yet there is something enchanting about the subtlety, the patience, and the creativity of these signals. They remind us that love does not always need words. Sometimes it thrives in the quiet spaces between gestures, in the hidden meanings that only two people can see. In the end, secret codes and signals were not just games of flirtation. They were lifelines for couples trying to navigate a world that gave them little room to be themselves. They turned everyday objects into symbols of longing, and they transformed silence into a language richer than words. For the Victorians, love was often silent, but it was never mute. In Victorian society, love was never just a matter of two hearts. It was a negotiation that involved entire families, with parents, especially fathers, holding the power to approve or deny a match. Family approval was not simply a formality, it was the foundation of courtship. A couple might exchange glances across a ballroom, share a dance, or even pass love letters in secret. But without the blessing of their families, especially the young woman's, romance could not progress toward marriage. Love and duty were woven together, and approval was the thread that held them in place. For daughters of the middle and upper classes, the family's reputation and financial stability were deeply tied to whom they married. A father was not only the head of the household but also the guardian of his daughter's future. He considered not just her happiness, but also the suitor's wealth, background, occupation, and moral character. A gentleman of good breeding but little fortune might be viewed as a poor match, while a wealthy man with questionable manners might also be rejected. The decision was rarely about love alone. It was about whether the marriage would secure or strengthen the family's standing in society. Mothers played a role too, though often in quieter ways. While fathers weighed finances and reputation, mothers observed manners, character, and compatibility. A mother might notice whether a young man was attentive but respectful, whether he had good table manners, or whether he spoke kindly to servants. She might advise her daughter privately, hinting at which suitors were suitable and which should be avoided. In this way, both parents shaped the course of romance, guiding it with watchful eyes and steady hands. Approval was often tested through visits and calls. A gentleman wishing to court a young lady would present his card at the family's home, asking permission to call. If the family accepted, he might be invited to tea or dinner, where his behavior would be carefully scrutinized. Was he polite in conversation? Did he show respect to the parents? Did he demonstrate stability and seriousness? A man who passed these silent tests might be invited back again. A man who failed might find his calls unanswered, his presence no longer welcome. The weight of family approval meant that many romances moved slowly. Couples could not rush ahead on their own. They had to wait for the right signals from parents. Even if a young woman had feelings for a suitor, she might hesitate to encourage him if she knew her father disapproved. A young man, too, might hold back his declarations until he had secured the family's trust. This waiting period could be frustrating, but it also added intensity to the smallest gestures. A smile exchanged during a visit, a polite compliment overheard by the mother, a thoughtful gift approved by the father. Each step was part of the larger process of winning not only the heart of the beloved, but the blessing of her family. We can imagine a scene in a quiet Victorian parlor. A young man sits on a stiff-backed chair, speaking politely with the father of the household. The daughter sits nearby, embroidering quietly, her mother close at hand. The young man talks of his work, his plans for the future, his respect for the values of the home. His voice is calm, but inside he feels the weight of the father's judgment. Every word matters. The daughter listens, stealing quick glances at him, hoping her father will see what she sees. The mother notices his courtesy, his neat appearance, his careful attention to detail. At the end of the evening, when the door closes behind him, the parents exchange a look. Approval is not spoken aloud, but it begins to take shape. Not all stories ended so smoothly. Some fathers refused suitors who lacked fortune or title, even if the daughter felt affection for them. The pain of disapproval could be sharp, and many young women were torn between duty and desire. To defy family approval was rare, but it did happen, and such stories often became the talk of towns and villages. A young couple who ran away together to marry against parental wishes risked being cut off, disowned, or shunned by polite society. For some, the cost was too high. For others, love was worth the risk. Family approval also extended beyond the immediate household. Relatives, neighbors, and even family friends weighed in, offering opinions and judgments. A suitor's reputation in the community mattered greatly. If he was known to gamble, drink too much, or behave improperly, whispers could spread quickly, undermining his chances before he ever stepped into the parlor. Conversely, a man known for honesty, hard work, and reliability could win approval more easily, even if he lacked wealth. Reputation was a currency as valuable as money, and families guarded it fiercely. For young men, winning approval could be a long campaign. They wrote polite letters, visited regularly, and demonstrated stability over time. Some offered gifts not only to the lady but also to her parents. Flowers for the mother, respect for the father, kindness toward younger siblings. These gestures built trust, showing that he was serious and that he valued the family as a whole, not just the daughter. Approval was earned step by step until at last a father might nod his agreement, opening the path to formal engagement. Looking back, the emphasis on family approval might seem restrictive, even unfair. Today, we think of love as a deeply personal choice, belonging to the couple alone. But in the Victorian era, marriage was not only a union of individuals but also of families, fortunes, and reputations. Approval was not meant to stifle love but to protect it, to ensure that it was built on a foundation strong enough to last. Whether or not that always worked is another question, but for the Victorians, it was the way of life. In the end, family approval was the gate through which every romance had to pass. Couples could whisper through fans, exchange glances on the dance floor, or share letters filled with longing. But without the father's blessing and the mother's quiet consent, those gestures remained suspended dreams. Approval made love possible, transforming secret signals into formal courtship and, eventually, marriage. It was the rule that bound romance to duty, ensuring that love moved forward with the weight of family behind it. Engagement in the Victorian era was not simply the joyous moment we imagine today, with a man dropping to one knee and a woman eagerly saying yes. It was a carefully structured stage of life, filled with rituals, expectations, and rules that signaled to society that a couple was moving toward marriage. An engagement was both personal and public, a promise of love but also a binding agreement between families. For many, it was one of the most significant transitions in life, full of excitement but also surrounded by duty and formality. A proposal itself was often less dramatic than modern ones. Rarely did a gentleman surprise a lady in some spontaneous moment. Instead, the process was slow and deliberate. A suitor usually sought permission from the young woman's father before proposing, to ask for her hand without her family. Approval would have been considered rash and even insulting. Once the father gave his blessing, the gentleman might approach the young lady directly, either during a quiet walk, in the garden, or in the presence of her family. The words were often formal and sometimes awkward, but the meaning was profound. He was offering his future and asking her to join it. If she accepted, The engagement was not only a private agreement but a public declaration. Families announced the news formally, often in the local newspaper, where names and details were recorded for all to see. Engagements were celebrated by relatives, neighbors, and friends, who understood that this was not just about two people, but about the joining of households. With the announcement came expectations. The couple was now bound together in the eyes of society, and breaking off an engagement carried serious consequences. One of the most enduring symbols of engagement was the ring. Victorian engagement rings often featured gold bands set with gemstones, sometimes diamonds, sometimes sapphires or rubies. The style depended on taste and wealth, but the meaning was always the same: permanence and devotion. Some rings included elaborate designs, such as intertwined initials or hidden compartments holding a lock of hair. Rings were worn proudly, not only as tokens of love but also as visible proof of a binding promise. To see a ring on a young woman's hand was to know she was spoken for, her future already in motion. Engagements could last for months or even years. Long engagements were common, especially if the groom-to-be needed time to establish his career or if families wanted to ensure financial stability before marriage. During this period, couples were allowed greater freedom than before. They might take longer walks together, exchange more frequent letters, and spend time in each other's company with fewer restrictions, though always within the bounds of propriety. The engagement was like a bridge, more open than courtship, but not yet the intimacy of marriage. Still, even within engagement, rules applied. Public displays of affection were limited. Couples might sit together at family gatherings, share private conversations, and even hold hands occasionally, but anything more was frowned upon. Society believed that affection should be restrained until marriage, so the engagement was a time of patience and discipline. The restraint, however, often made the anticipation even stronger. The thought of a shared future, already promised but not yet realized, gave every moment a quiet sense of longing. Gifts were common during engagement, and they carried symbolic weight. Gentlemen gave jewelry, books, or portraits. Ladies might embroider handkerchiefs or offer tokens of affection such as pressed flowers. Families exchanged gifts, too, marking the union as something larger than just two people. Engagement parties were sometimes held, especially among wealthier families, where the couple was formally celebrated. These gatherings allowed friends and relatives to show support, while also providing another chance for society to judge the match's suitability. We can imagine such a moment in a Victorian home. A young woman sits by the fire, her new engagement ring catching the glow of the flames. Her fiancé sits nearby, speaking with her father about his plans for a new business venture. Her mother asks gently about the wedding dress, the church, the flowers. Though the conversation is practical, the young woman feels her heart swell as she listens. For her, the promise of love has become a promise of life together, and though she must wait patiently, the path ahead is clear. Not every engagement was smooth, however. Families sometimes disagreed, financial troubles could arise, or secrets could come to light. To break an engagement was considered scandalous, especially for the woman. People whispered, reputations suffered, and in some cases, the family's honor was permanently stained. That is why engagements were entered into with such seriousness. They were not casual promises. They were binding contracts of affection and duty. The rituals of engagement reflected Victorian values: stability, propriety, and respect for tradition. Love was important, but it was framed by responsibility. The ring, the announcement, the long waiting period, all served to remind couples that marriage was not to be rushed into but prepared for with care. Engagements taught patience, discipline, and the art of balancing personal desire with social duty. Looking back, we may find these rituals formal, even heavy, compared to today's spontaneous proposals and quick weddings. But for Victorians, this formality gave romance weight and meaning. The engagement was a time of promise, a period when two lives began to weave together under the watchful eyes of family and society. It was not just about the thrill of love, but about building a foundation strong enough to last a lifetime. In the end, engagement rituals remind us of how seriously Victorians took the step between courtship and marriage. They saw it not as a moment, but as a season, a time to prepare, to prove devotion, and to honor the responsibilities that came with love. Behind the rules and rituals was the simple truth. Two people had chosen each other, and though they had to wait, their futures were now bound together in hope and promise. In Victorian society, a broken engagement was one of the greatest social scandals a family could endure. Unlike today, where ending an engagement might bring disappointment but rarely lifelong consequences, in the 19th century it carried the weight of ruined reputations, whispered gossip, and, at times, even legal disputes. An engagement was not viewed as a casual promise. It was considered almost as binding as marriage itself, a public declaration that two lives and two families were preparing to unite. To break that promise was to break trust, and in a culture that prized honor, duty, and appearances, such a rupture could echo for years. When an engagement ended, the first question always asked was, who was at fault? If the man broke it off, he risked being labeled dishonorable, unreliable, and untrustworthy. His reputation in society, and particularly in business or politics, could suffer greatly. A man who failed to keep his word to a lady was seen as someone who might not keep his word in larger matters. For a gentleman, honor was everything, and abandoning an engagement could brand him with a stain difficult to remove. For women, however, the consequences were even harsher. If a young lady ended an engagement, people often assumed she had been fickle, selfish, or worse, that there had been impropriety. Even if she was not at fault, society sometimes blamed her simply because she had been the one left behind. A broken engagement could damage her chances of securing another suitor, as whispers of rejection or scandal followed her. People might say she had been too forward, too cold, or not respectable enough to hold a man's devotion. In a world where a woman's reputation was her most valuable asset, such gossip was devastating. The return of engagement gifts added to the drama. Rings, lockets, or tokens given during courtship were supposed to be returned if the engagement ended. To keep them was seen as improper, even greedy, unless the man had behaved disgracefully, in which case some believed the woman had a right to keep the ring as compensation. But the act of returning a gift was often painful, symbolic of a love lost and a promise undone. The small box handed back across a table, the letters tied together and returned unread. These gestures were as final as a slammed door. Families, too, felt the weight of scandal. A broken engagement was not just about two individuals, but about the connections between households. Parents who had proudly announced the match now faced embarrassment. Invitations sent, arrangements discussed, expectations built. All of these were undone in an instant. Neighbors whispered, family friends asked quiet questions, and rivals in society sometimes seized on the scandal to raise their own standing. For ambitious families, the loss of an advantageous match could feel like a setback in both status and opportunity. There were even legal implications. In some cases, a broken engagement led to lawsuits. Women, or their families, sometimes sued men for breach of promise to marry. These cases were sensational, filling newspapers with scandalous details. Letters exchanged between lovers were read aloud in court, exposing private emotions to the public eye. Such trials were humiliating for everyone involved, but they also showed how seriously Victorians took the promise of engagement. A man could be ordered to pay damages for breaking off a marriage, not just for the financial loss, but for the injury to the woman's reputation. Despite the risks, engagements did sometimes break. Sometimes financial troubles made marriage impossible. Sometimes secrets came to light, debts, affairs, or hidden family scandals that changed everything. And sometimes simply love faded, though few dared to say so aloud. In these cases, families often tried to keep the matter as quiet as possible, ending things with dignity before the gossip could spread. But in small towns and close circles, silence was rarely enough. People noticed when visits stopped, when a ring disappeared, when a young woman's smile dimmed. The whispers always followed. We can picture a parlor where such a scene unfolds. A young woman sits with trembling hands, the engagement ring resting in her lap. Across from her, her former fiancé avoids her gaze, speaking stiffly of circumstances and necessity. Her mother sits beside her, face pale with controlled anger, while her father's eyes burn with disappointment. The young man takes the ring, places it back in its box, and stands to leave. The door closes softly, but the silence left behind is heavy. The family knows that before the week is out, the neighbors will know, and with them, the entire town. The scandal of broken engagements reminds us of how tightly love and duty were bound in the Victorian era. To fall in love was one thing, but to make a promise to marry was to enter into a contract with far-reaching consequences. Breaking that promise shook not only hearts but entire communities. It revealed the fragility of reputation, the weight of family expectations, and the constant tension between personal desire and social duty. Looking back, it may seem harsh, even cruel, to punish people so heavily for ending an engagement. Yet in the Victorian mind, marriage was not just about love, it was about honor, stability, and the preservation of social order. A broken engagement was therefore more than personal disappointment. It was a crack in the structure of society itself. And that is why it drew such shock, such whispers, and such lasting echoes. For Victorians, the wedding day was not only the conclusion of courtship and engagement, but also the grand moment when love, duty, and society all came together. After months or even years of carefully supervised romance, after endless scrutiny from parents and relatives, and after long periods of waiting during engagement, the wedding was the reward. It was a day filled with ritual, symbolism, and meaning, a public celebration that transformed a couple from suitors into husband and wife. Unlike today, where weddings can be highly personalized and creative, Victorian weddings followed strict traditions. The ceremony was not just about the couple, it was about their families, their reputations, and their place in society. Everything, from the dress to the guest list to the location, carried significance. The details were not random. They reflected values of purity, respectability, and stability. For the Victorians, a wedding was as much about showing the world who they were as it was about celebrating love. The bride was, of course, the center of attention. By the mid-19th century, white had become the most fashionable choice for wedding gowns, thanks in part to Queen Victoria herself, who wore white when she married Prince Albert in 1840. The color symbolized purity, innocence, and virtue, qualities highly prized in a Victorian bride. Dresses were often made of fine fabrics like silk or satin, trimmed with lace and ribbons. Veils became popular too, adding an air of mystery and modesty. Some brides wore flowers woven into their hair or carried bouquets of orange blossoms, which symbolized fertility and eternal love. The groom's attire was far less dramatic but equally formal. Dark suits, often in black or deep gray with crisp white shirts and gloves, were standard. His role was to appear steady, respectable, and dignified. Unlike the bride, who symbolized beauty and innocence, the groom embodied strength, stability, and responsibility. Together, their clothing presented the Victorian ideal of marriage, a union of virtue and reliability, of purity and protection. The ceremony itself usually took place in a church, witnessed by family, friends, and neighbors. Marriage was a religious and social contract, and the church setting reinforced its seriousness. The vows, though familiar to us today, carried immense weight in an age when divorce was rare and frowned upon. To pledge love, honor, and fidelity was to bind oneself for life. The exchange of rings symbolized this permanence. For Victorians, the circle of the ring was a symbol of eternity, without beginning or end, just as marriage was meant to last forever. After the ceremony, celebrations varied depending on wealth and status. Wealthier families often hosted elaborate receptions with music, dancing, and banquets. Tables were laden with food, from roasted meats to sweet confections, and towering wedding cakes became a centerpiece of the festivities. These cakes, often layered and decorated with white icing, were cut by the couple together, symbolizing their shared future. Guests were sometimes given small tokens, such as sugared almonds or pieces of cake wrapped in paper, as reminders of the day. For middle and working-class families, weddings were simpler but no less meaningful. A modest meal, perhaps at the bride's family home, with relatives and close friends, was enough to mark the occasion. Even without grandeur, the sense of joy and hope was the same. Marriage was a new beginning, and the community came together to celebrate it, no matter the scale. One of the most anticipated parts of a Victorian wedding was the departure of the couple. After the celebrations, they often left for a honeymoon, a relatively new tradition in the 19th century. The honeymoon was not the exotic travel we think of today, but often a quiet journey to visit relatives or a brief holiday in the countryside. It was both a chance for the couple to begin their life together and, symbolically, a transition from the public gaze of family into the private bond of marriage. Yet, even in marriage, Victorian ideals of duty and reputation continued. A bride was expected to carry her purity and virtue into her new role as wife and mother, while the groom was expected to provide stability and financial security. The wedding day marked not only the fulfillment of romantic dreams, but also the start of responsibilities. Love was celebrated, but it was also framed within the structure of family, duty, and society. We can picture such a day in vivid detail. The bells of a small parish church ring out across the countryside. Villagers gather to watch as a bride, dressed in white silk with a veil trailing behind her, steps carefully down the aisle on her father's arm. Her groom waits at the altar, steady and solemn. The vows are spoken, the rings exchanged, and the congregation breathes a collective sigh of joy. Outside, petals are thrown as the couple exits, their smiles brighter than the sunlight. For a brief moment, all the rules and rituals of courtship seem worthwhile, for they have led to this, the moment when two lives become one. Looking back, Victorian weddings reveal much about the values of the era. They remind us that marriage was not seen as a private adventure but as a public institution, carefully guarded by tradition and watched by society. Yet within the formality, there was genuine joy, hope, and love. Couples may have been shaped by duty, but they were also human, and their wedding day was a moment of celebration where, at last, they could step into a new life together. In the end, weddings were the culmination of everything Victorian courtship stood for: patience, propriety, family approval, and love, restrained until the proper moment. After years of waiting, of glances and signals, of letters and visits, the wedding was the day when restraint gave way to fulfillment. It was the day when promises became reality, and when two people bound by love and duty began the journey of a lifetime. In the Victorian era, the line between love and duty was often blurred. Today, we think of marriage as a deeply personal choice, guided mostly by love and companionship. But in the 19th century, it was far more complicated. For many Victorians, love was important, yes, but it was not always the deciding factor. Marriage was a partnership that carried enormous social weight. It was about uniting families, securing wealth, improving social position, and fulfilling expectations passed down by parents and communities. To marry purely for love was considered romantic, but also risky. To marry for duty was considered wise, even if it meant sacrificing some personal happiness. Family expectations were at the heart of many unions. Parents believed it was their duty to guide their children into marriages that would secure their future. A wealthy father, for instance, might want his daughter to marry a man of equal or greater fortune, ensuring that the family's social standing would not diminish. Similarly, a young man might be encouraged or even pressured to seek a bride whose dowry or inheritance could strengthen his prospects. These arrangements were not always cold or loveless, but they were practical. In many cases, affection grew later, after the marriage had already been secured. Wealth played a crucial role. For the upper classes, marriage was often a way to preserve or increase family fortunes. A union between two powerful families could consolidate land, property, and influence. For the middle classes, money brought stability and respectability, and marrying into a family with solid finances was seen as a way to climb higher in society. Even among the working classes, financial security was a driving force. A man who could provide steady income was considered a suitable match, while a woman who brought a small dowry or useful skills was valued as a partner. In all layers of society, money and stability were tied directly to marriage, making love only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Status was equally important. The Victorian world was rigidly hierarchical, and social climbing was both difficult and highly sought after. Marriage became one of the few ways to move up the ladder. For an ambitious family, marrying a daughter into a higher social circle was a victory, even if the match lacked passion. The rise of wealthy industrial families in the 19th century added another twist. These new money families often sought titles and aristocratic connections through marriage, while the old aristocracy, struggling with declining fortunes, sometimes welcomed the match for financial reasons. This exchange of wealth for status was so common that it became almost expected, creating marriages that balanced love with cold calculation. Duty extended beyond wealth and status. Religious and moral expectations also shaped decisions. Society placed enormous pressure on individuals to marry. Remaining unmarried for too long, especially for women, was considered unfortunate or even shameful. An unmarried woman risked being labeled a spinster, while unmarried men could be viewed as irresponsible or unreliable. For many, marrying, even without love, was seen as better than facing the judgment that came with lifelong singleness. In this sense, marriage was not only a personal choice but a social obligation, one that tied individuals to the expectations of their families and their communities. This does not mean that love was absent from Victorian marriages. Many couples did marry out of genuine affection, and love could certainly flourish within the bonds of duty. But the way Victorians understood love was different from how we see it today. They believed that love could grow from respect, companionship, and shared responsibility. A young woman might not feel passionate affection for her husband when they first married, but she might come to admire his steadiness, his kindness, or his ability to provide. Similarly, a man might value his wife's loyalty, her dedication to the home, and her role in raising children. Love, in this sense, was not always the fiery passion of romance novels, but a quieter, steadier bond that developed over time. We can imagine a household where this balance played out. A young woman, raised in comfort, marries a man chosen partly for his fortune and partly for his respectable family name. At first, her feelings are mild, perhaps even uncertain. But as years pass, she learns to appreciate his reliability, his devotion to their children, and his respect for her role in the home. The marriage may not have begun with great passion, but it becomes one of trust and mutual understanding. For Victorians, this was often considered more valuable than fleeting emotions. Stability and duty outweighed romance, and in many cases, the system worked as intended. But not all marriages found this balance. There were also unions marked by disappointment, resentment, or quiet sorrow. Some women found themselves trapped in marriages that brought wealth but little joy, paired with husbands they could never admire or love. Some men discovered that their marriages, though socially advantageous, left them lonely or unfulfilled. Divorce was rare and stigmatized, so many endured these mismatched unions in silence. Literature of the time often reflected this reality, with novels exploring the tension between love and duty, the heartbreak of failed marriages, and the longing for something more than financial security. The stories of those who married for love against family wishes also reveal much about Victorian society. These couples often faced enormous challenges, from financial struggles to social disapproval. Yet their stories captivated the public imagination, precisely because they represented defiance of duty in favor of passion. Such marriages were rare but memorable, celebrated in novels and whispered about in drawing rooms. They were both admired and criticized, symbols of the tension between individual desire and social expectation. In the end, Victorian marriage was a balancing act. Love was idealized, but duty was demanded. Couples were encouraged to find affection within the structures of wealth, status, and expectation, and many did. Others struggled, caught between the desire for happiness and the weight of obligation. For Victorians, marriage was never simple. It was a contract, a social bond, a family strategy, and, sometimes, a love story. To understand their marriages is to understand the world they lived in, a world where personal feelings were often second to duty, but where love still managed to find its place growing quietly in the spaces left open by tradition and expectation. And that brings us to the end of our quiet journey into Victorian romance. We've seen how love was never just about two hearts. It was a performance played before families, neighbors, and society itself. A world where gifts were symbols, dances were negotiations, and even marriage was often as much about duty as desire. Yet, within all those rules, real love still found a way to grow, quietly and stubbornly, in the spaces left open by tradition. When you think about it, maybe love hasn't changed as much as we think. We still send signals, wait for replies, hope for approval, and search for connection. The details are different, but the longing is the same. If you enjoyed this journey through the hidden side of Victorian dating, don't forget to give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow. And if you'd like more calm and fascinating stories from history to fall asleep to, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for listening, sleep well if you're using this to drift off, and I'll see you in the next story.